issues. And Brandon, I just want to start by asking you to take a broad view. All right, so you're mopping toilets, mopping floors, cleaning. Is that how you do it? I haven't done it in so long. I know, it's been like 2 days. Mopping floors, cleaning toilets. And it got you to where you're here today, all right? You know, I have a story I share that I proposed to my wife. I actually proposed to my wife in a garbage dump. I didn't know it, so but I proposed to her in a garbage dump. And I tell people sometimes it was a little foreshadowing of the future work I'd have in the Capitol, all right? So maybe there's a little foreshadowing of some of the stuff that you're going to be involved with in your muckraking and what you're doing there at the Christian Post. Help us to understand why it's so important that believers are involved in the media, in the culture, in the arts, in journalism. I know you got a heart for that.
Yes, it's so important that Christians be scribes of the truth, because I always thought that the media was slanted growing up and had a certain ideological flavor to it. But when I became a journalist, I realized that they are deliberately deceptive, that it was worse than I ever knew. And I think the gender issue especially crystallizes that. I noticed my first day on the job, just to give you an idea, was the day after that horrible massacre at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. And so I was thrown into covering some of these LGBTQ issues. This was 2016, so it was a year after the Obergefell ruling. And I saw right away how language was being manipulated in service to terrible lies, and I, as a Christian, just wouldn't have that on my conscience to participate in that journalistically. And I know we'll talk about it, but the systemic, ideological, institutional capture of all of our, realms of society, the government, the medical system, and everywhere, is the worst in the media, because if they can change what you say and how you think, they can really transform culture very quickly. And so Christians need to be the fly in the ointment that says, actually, no, we're going to stick to the unvarnished truth no matter what, and bring your convictions to bear upon your profession, especially in what should be a very honorable profession, that reporting the truth, helping people make informed decisions, what's going on, and why they should care about it. We need good Christians to be in journalism, because the whole profession is captured by a lot of lies, and some very consequential ones at that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the things we talk about as an organization is our role in the culture at large, and one of the things we try to do is to reprove that which is evil, to put some light on it, to show what's happening. And the Christian Post does not shy away from those issues. Sometimes they're in the church, and sometimes they're outside the church. And wherever they find those things happening, the Christian Post has been diligent and fair to report those things. So I appreciate Brandon's work in that. I think it gives a real authenticity to what they're doing in the media as a journalist. And as a journalist, Brandon's here. He's not going to be weighing in the legislation or advocacy or any of those things. He has an independent role here. Maybe you can address that for a minute.
Well, I mean, broadly speaking, at Christian Post's motto is to bring a biblical worldview on the news of the day. We want to have a very, a truly gospel-centered, oops, the phone's about to fall, a worldview that's centered on the gospel. And so, obviously, I'm not allowed to testify in support of legislation, even if I happen to agree with it, because sometimes there's funky things within state law that could then come back to bite us in the backside, and we don't want to do that. And so I'd like to keep a line between advocacy, activism, and reporting, but the values that are in the FPA sort of orbit and with New York Families are very much biblically rooted, and our statement of faith very much reflects that as a publication. And so we do have a perspective, but that's not hidden. And I think what is really so frustrating is that a lot of the quote-unquote mainstream news outlets like to pretend that they are neutral and unbiased when nothing could be further from the truth. And so, at least with the Christian Post, you know that we are informed by the gospel, and that shapes our news coverage and our commentary, and it's not hidden.
Okay, so we're going to start delving into the issue he came to talk about in particular, but there's a video clip that I believe is queued up that Brandon was a part of. And I want you to watch that clip. We're going to step off for just a minute so you can watch the video clip. Then we'll come back, we'll discuss kind of a broad overview of where we are in the transgender issue, where we're going from here, and really delve into some topics that are very much at the front and attention of a lot of people right now in the culture and, well, in every realm of society. So let's watch that video clip, and we'll jump back up here.
If you want girl parts and you don't have them, you can do special surgery where they turn your penis inside out and there's a vagina inside.
Preschool sends out a letter to all the parents announcing one of our students is now Rosa, and we would love you all to come and celebrate and support her. And he was 4 years old. I didn't even know if he knew what a pronoun was. I go to the daycare a week later to drop him off, and it's Rosa is written on the entrance sheet where I have to sign. Rosa is on his cubby. It's everywhere. And they would just look at me and listen. They would say, Helen, you should really learn to accept this and celebrate it. And I'm like, celebrate what? Celebrate that my child's going to be put on hormones and his penis will never grow and he'll never have a normal sex life and he'll be on drugs for the rest of his life?
This was when she was like 15. I remember being up in her room and she said, I'm trans and I need a new name. Somehow I got a text from CVS. Your prescription for TES is available. She's like, it's mine. You can't take it from me. You can get this by making a phone call and having a tele appointment. I mean, there was no psychological evaluation. There was nothing. Where does our species go if you can cut off your body parts like this?
Sean had set up an appointment with an endocrinologist at the hospital to try to get hormones. I'm looking at it as, hey, this kid just needs to explain to him, hey, he's had a lot of traumatic events through his life, losing his leg. We had an older son that died of a heroin overdose when he was 8 years old. He went through the loss of his mom, being diagnosed with cancer. I mean, I went through I said, all these things have to have a big effect on him. When I had the appointment with the psychiatrist, I was just blown away when she turned around and told me that he's definitely transgender, and you are an unsupportive, abusive father. I'm trying to keep him alive.
Dead Name is actually available on Amazon Prime. You can rent it for free. You can buy it for like $4. It's $3.99. But it's available. You can rent it for free on Amazon Prime if you want to check that out. And Brandon, would you tell us a little bit about that project and how you got involved with that?
Yeah, I think it's very inexpensive, like $2 or $3 to see it on Amazon Prime or Roku or Apple TV. Deadnamedocumentary.com is the original landing page. It was on when you saw my picture there. Yeah, I was an independent filmmaker, not a religious person, and not like it matters, but she would be in disagreement with a lot of the things that New York Families agrees with. But she had seen a speech that I had given that, interestingly enough, a radical feminist friend of mine had sent her. This was a speech I gave in 2020, and she reached out and she said, I'm making a movie profiling how transgenderism ruptures families. She became in touch with these 3 parents that she profiled and many, many others, and asked if I would be a contributing expert voice. And so along with a clinical psychiatrist and me, we make 2 brief appearances after these stories are featured, and it's called Dead Name because I think there's been attention to the sports issue and some to the medicalization of giving children puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries on minors in the culture, thanks in large part due to the advocacy of FPA and groups like yours. But what has not gone discussed is how this fractures families, erodes the parent-child bond, and just creates unimaginable heartache in its wake. And so this really humanizes the story from the parent's perspective. And I think if you all know anybody in your communities that have been affected by this, this is an otherworldly suffering. Parents who reach out to me, and I've lost count how many I've spoken to across the political spectrum, use the words shattered and shredded to describe what has happened to their lives because of when their kids get mired in this. It's a nightmare on steroids.
You've been doing this for about 8.5 years now, and you've certainly seen some change in the issue over that time. I mean, I'm amazed that this is on Amazon Prime.
Well, and when this was first released in the December 2022, 35 days later or so, this was originally uploaded to Vimeo, and Vimeo censored it. And they took it down, and we used the censorship to try to turn it around and rehome it. But it's night and day difference now that finally this can be on a mainstream platform. We've had to work very hard because the media is, I think, the most ideologically captured and censorious, organ that has not allowed criticism of gender ideology. It's only been through independent, conservative, and Christian media where you sort of punched through the media blockade because the censorship apparatus around this is ideologically enforced very rigidly.
And so in that 8.5 years, and we acknowledge that this is now on the platform, Ryan T. Anderson's book that was blocked for years is now available. You can purchase it on Amazon and other places now. Elon Musk is now tweeting some of these things out there. Like, just talk
personally affected by it.
Yeah,
It's his own
personally
son.
affected by it. That's actually I was going to ask you to talk about. Help us to understand, kind of frame the debate for where are we in this movement?
If I use a sports analogy, I would say if on November 4th, the day before the election, we were 30 points down, we are now 15 points down. We are by no means winning yet, even though it is tremendous to have federal government agencies empowered to do investigations, and there have been some executive orders along these lines, which I think will help at the federal level to bring further light and exposure. But this is just getting started. I mean, you say 8.5 years. When I first started reporting on this, even I was trying to get my head around it. And trans activists and gender identity ideologues, they have worked so stealthily in the shadows for so many years to insert policies and laws that they did it in the dark of night. Nobody knew what was going on. And so for the bulk of my career, when I started, I was just trying to get people to believe that this was really happening, and people couldn't because it would just paralyze them. Analysis paralysis. They couldn't believe something so horrible would be allowed to go on. And then finally, just through persistence, my colleagues and I, in a few publications, we were able to produce enough receipts and talk to enough people to actually force the issue. And I think what finally changed the discussion was when 2021 and 2022, we had a few states start to prohibit the medicalization of children with blockers, hormones, and surgery, and the sports bills were also starting to be passed. But then in 2023, in that year alone, there were 17 states that said, we're not doing this to children. And then the public finally seemed to wake up and say, okay, well, wait a minute. Why are states banning this if this is not happening? Clearly, I don't support cutting off 12-year-old girls' breasts. Yes, that is happening. I can prove it. I don't support cutting off the genitals of 15-year-old boys. That's wrong. Children wind up sterile when you give them puberty blockers and combine it with cross-sex hormones. Sterilizing children, they can't give consent to that. No. And then this whole notion of the ideology, and they started to see how this was in the schools, children being indoctrinated, and it just, through persistence, I think people really started to understand that this was so much bigger than they ever knew. And it's why one of the tactics that's being employed now, especially on the left, is, oh, it's just a few people, it's just a few people. The issue is not small. And just think about it for a moment. 10 years ago, had you said, a doctor's cutting off a 12-year-old girl's healthy breasts, that would have been, and should have been, a national scandal, something that 60 Minutes featured on how in the world did a doctor cut off the healthy body parts of one kid. Now there are thousands documented. And when you consider young adults, it's tens of thousands. And then when you consider getting Planned Parenthood testosterone in 30 minutes from a phone call, we don't know how many people have gotten hormones. I called Planned Parenthood once and said, I want hormones, but do you think it'll hurt my brain? My friend said that the frontal lobe, the lobes don't develop until you're 25. I pretended like I was 23. And the Planned Parenthood rep said to me, that sounds like smoke coming out of nowhere. So this is an unchecked medical experiment and scandal on a very vulnerable and struggling generation. It's a huge problem, and the ideology, even if you want to make the point about numbers being relatively small, when you think about it from a country of 330 million people, the ideology is everywhere. It's in our schools, it's in our hospitals, it's in the media, it's in our prisons. There are male rapists and murderers who can self-declare themselves female and be transferred into the women's jails. I'm sure it's probably happening in New York, it's definitely happening in New Jersey and California, and I'll never forget the day when some of those, I got word that some of those California female inmates told me they were praying and fasting for the Christian Post. Those inmates in California, because they're being tormented every day by these predators that have now been legally allowed to share prison quarters with the women, many of whom have come from domestic violence backgrounds, and so it's just, the cruelty is just doubled because prison for most of them was the only safe space that they have ever known. And so it's everywhere.
And that's what I was going to say. These are incarcerated individuals. They have nowhere else to go. And in prisons here in New York, they're being housed with members of the opposite sex. Like, how scary that must be.
Well, and did my master's degree in human rights, and even though I know it's not exactly the same legal context, the Geneva Convention prohibits the housing of male and female prisoners together, or wartime context, but somehow that standard doesn't apply domestically because of transgender ideology. So this is a tremendous human rights violation from an international standpoint. It should be, but all bets are off when you have ideologues in charge of our institutions that are forcing this lie.
One of the things I like to point out is that the only consistent worldview is the biblical worldview. Like, every other ism, every other worldview breaks down if you go down that road far enough. And you see that in the ideologies we talk about, whether it's life, beginning or end of life, or this issue itself. There's so many inconsistencies by those who advocate for those positions, but the biblical worldview gives us this view that is it's logical, it makes sense, and it's how God created and designed things to work. And so I just throw that in there. That's the free part. Whenever something is moving at the federal level, and we'll say, and I'll just say in a more positive direction of some of the issues that I care about, oftentimes there is pushback in blue states. That pendulum tends to swing, and that opposite and equal reaction is pretty heavy sometimes in blue states. So can you talk to me about kind of the horizon? What can we anticipate in the upcoming political and legal battles, and particularly in those blue states? What do we need to be looking out for?
Well, many of the executive orders that President Trump has signed have indeed been contested and are being contested in the courts. And that does include the gender ideology executive orders. That's being, the most significant one, I think, was the one that he signed on January 28th, where a couple states have been pushing back against that one. And that one is the one of calling so-called gender-affirming care for minors a stain on our nation's history, and it must end. When I saw that, I was just like, I love the unequivocal language in it. It's so right on. But the blue states are doubling down, and so it's going to be ugly because the Democratic Party is ideologically dug in at the leadership level, certainly at the national level in some states, especially in the South and Midwest, which is where the prohibitions have been passed in, I think, about half of the states. Kansas just joined the ranks. There have been a few Democrats that have crossed over. But they are punished heavily for doing so. They often get primaried. A lot of them are black Americans who are Democrats that, I'll tell you a story in a minute about one such case, but the blue states are going to fight back. However, there are also some who at least appear to be pivoting. Here in New York, NYU Langone, the hospital, very prominent, said that they were going to be pausing gender transitions on children. And there was a protest, and I know Cynthia Nixon went out there to make a big stink. So much federal money goes to hospitals, and so that is a tremendous tool that hospitals do depend on, Medicare, Medicaid. And so if they're not going to get those dollars because that's going to be withheld because hospitals are doing these awful things to children, that's a tremendous tool. But I don't have any evidence to accuse NYU Langone of this or any other hospital, including others that are really known for gender transitions, like Children's Hospital LA, which also said that they're stopping this temporarily. I wonder if they're lying. Because if I know trans activists, they don't take no for an answer, even when you do pass policies with teeth. And so Bunny Pounds was talking about being engaged. You need to pray for anybody and anyone who is in these systems to keep their eyes open, because they lie, they deceive, they go stealth, they find ways to circumvent and manipulate. I hope that NYU Langone is keeping its word that they are not doing this anymore. But I wouldn't trust them. I wouldn't trust anybody unless you actually see concrete results from the inside. One such example in Texas, there was a whistleblower nurse by the name of Vanessa Sivage who wound up corroborating the testimony of a surgeon who was exposing that this was still going on in Texas, even though they had passed a law. They lied about it. But what Vanessa, in addition to corroborating his testimony, exposed was that the activist doctors in the field were miscategorizing diagnoses, and they would say that if a boy who wanted hormones, they would just label it estrogen deficiency, even though he didn't have a deficiency of estrogen, but they would just make up the diagnosis. It's so medical fraud, basically, but that's what they do. And so they lie on medical records in order for them to get their drugs. I know of other detransitioners who said that they would be told that their condition was endocrine disorder unspecified. So they will find ways to get these drugs into the hands of young people who want them, because no one dares to challenge the transgender orthodoxy that's coming from high places. I think the other challenge with the blue states, too, is that they have, in addition to pushing back against the federal orders and being sneaky like they always are, is that there's a lot of other state entities where this is already enmeshed in all of the institutions of the state government. So that's just an additional challenge. But this ideology has not gone away, and even in the reddest of the red states, Alabama, just last week I met a surgeon from there who's been speaking out against this, and he says even the hospital systems in Alabama are still woke and captured. And I so like I said, you're still 15 points down. Like, this has not gone away, even with the tremendous leverage that we have in the federal government now. Now is the time when you pour on the steam, stomp on the gas, continue to raise the alarm, continue to do whatever God calls you to do to expose these atrocities, because if we lived in a sane world, we would be convening some tribunals for the crimes against children and humanity of what's been done in the name of gender.
Yeah, go ahead. So here in New York, we saw that when an executive order came down from the president, that there were hospitals like U of R in Rochester and NYU Langone that said that they were going to, well, they didn't publicly say it first. Parents were reporting that they were not getting appointments anymore for some of these hormone treatments and other things, and the pressure began. That created some state pressure as well. So Governor Kathy Hochul, Attorney General Letitia James, both issued strongly worded memos saying this is still the state law, you have to do this, you can't stop treating these individuals, that kind of thing. And so you saw some very definite pushback. And remember, the current state of matters in New York under our state law is you can help someone transition away from their biological sex, but you can't help them transition back to the way that God created them. And so the question I want to ask is, you've got a room full of believers here, right? A number of pastors here, a number of folks who are involved, just caring about people. What should we be thinking about? What can we be doing to help these individuals, as they're not going to get help from the state right now? They're not going to get help from doctors. What can we be doing to help right now?
Well, one thing that you must do and can do is to continue to tell the truth as often and as loudly and as relentlessly as possible. Because if you never tell it and you never know, and then people will never know that there's another option. And there is power in telling the truth, and I very much believe that transgenderism functions very much like a cult. And so people who get ensnared in this didn't reason their way into it, and so they're probably not going to reason their way out of it. And yet at the same time, I believe that you're speaking God's truth, and if you speak it, it never returns void, and so you still have to speak it. So that's the first thing. I think churches really need to get educated on the issue. I'll come speak at your church. But you also need to defend the counselors and the therapists in your congregations and in your neighborhoods, because they very well may, and the Supreme Court's just going to take this up here soon, so this is they could be thrown in, have their license pulled for even daring to suggest that there's nothing wrong with your body and that you're an integrated whole being, male and female. Like, it's the state apparatus is weaponized against them, and so they need to be supported. I also think it's just important to show a lot of compassion too and walk with people in their process, because you often find that if someone is truly swept, transgenderism does spread by social contagion, and there's many ways in which people fall into this kind of confusion, but it's usually not a standalone kind of state of things. They're often a response to bullying or sexual trauma or abuse, and so there's a whole lot of issues. It's not just the gender confusion that they're dealing with, but just to understand the weight of the top-down social engineering, big moneyed, powerful entities that are against you, and continue to pray, because at the root of all of this, I'm very mindful that Ephesians 6:12, this is, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers, principalities, and spiritual wickedness in high places. And 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4, that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God for the tearing down and destruction of strongholds. And so this may be a ruthless, vicious stronghold, but it's no match for King Jesus.
All right, I'm going to dig down a little more because I know your heart in this. I know your integrity, and you and I have gotten to know each other a little bit. I've met Brandon at a couple of events that we've had in other places in the country, and so we became Facebook friends and Instagram as well, I think now, right? And he's always posting pictures of dachshunds. He loves dachshunds, all right? So, and my wife does as well, so it's been a common point. We laugh when we look at the pictures together. But then you also are an amazing cook. And so you name it. I don't care what the, international foods, whatever it is, you were cooking all these amazing meals. And at first I'm looking at this picture, I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And then I'm realizing this is more than just a meal for you. This is a means of hospitality to welcome some pretty interesting people into your home. So I want you to share that heart of hospitality to encourage us to what we can do to reach people with the love of Christ.
Well, who doesn't love to eat? I mean, I'm a foodie, unabashed foodie, and just several years ago, I think I started to just wanted to extend the hope of the gospel to anyone and everyone that I come into contact with, and I think in a time where we have seen our faith challenged so much, that God can and will use faithful churches who are faithful to Him, and I'm not against the church. I'm a part of a church that I love, and if God's being exalted, He'll show up there, and so I'm not knocking the ministry that goes on within its four walls. But I just started to think, well, there are people that will probably never darken the door of a church, but they're very interested in what I have to say, because I thought when I was starting at the Christian Post that I was going to be entering into a bubble, an insular sort of conservative Christian world, and I felt called to it. So that sometimes you are in those bubbles, but nothing has been further from the truth, because as I started reporting on this, people who never read the Christian Post before were suddenly interested in what I was reporting on, because their kids were being swept up into this. Parents, very secular, often left-wing, from all over the country and the world, would reach out begging me for help. Some of them would say things to me like, I'm not sure I believe in God, but I think I believe in demons now because of what this has done to my family. Can you help? Can you pray for me? I mean, it's just unreal, the level of horrific suffering that these families endure. And then there are also others who, this is another silver lining, people who don't agree with socially conservative Christians on much of anything. This has thrown them off their center of gravity. This has fundamentally changed their politics in some cases. I've had lesbians and gays and feminists and secular people and a whole host over to my house for dinner just to talk, because they are scared out of their minds. And I'm happy to open the table up to him and just I wouldn't say kumbaya, powwow it out, but we just connected because they are alarmed. And frankly, if you've got a kid that might wind up sterile because they got Planned Parenthood hormones in 30 minutes, I don't care if you're a Democrat to the far left or a right-wing Republican, nobody wants to see a child or a young person harmed. No. I'm not gonna, far be it from me to be a partisan political hack. I do not care about your politics, your religion, or lack thereof. I will talk to anybody, because I would want if my child was in danger, I don't have a kid, but I would want all the help I can get. And people are willing to talk. And this space is kind of fraught because you find that anybody who's working on addressing the harms of gender ideology, it does require a certain personality. It's not for the faint of heart. And there's a lot of hard-headed, hot-headed, difficult people but I mean, we're made of tough stuff, and I really have been able to connect and bond with a lot of people who I never thought as a Christian post-journalist I would be speaking with. But I wrote about my experience of cooking some feasts for people on the blog Substack of a woman who describes herself as a radical feminist, hairy-legged, left-wing atheist Jew from Brooklyn. And I wrote about some of the guests, and these are precious people, and a lot of the sort of stereotypes and preconceived notions of who conservative-leaning Christians are break down when you get around the dinner table. And it's a beautiful thing, and I think the Holy Spirit's really moving, and I believe we're going to see some wonderful things come out of some really horrible things, and that's just like God, because he can redeem even the worst of evil for his glory.
Some years ago, we were working on a piece of legislation here in Albany, and there was a man on the other side of the issue that was opposing us. And I would see him walking around the Capitol, and he's was 6'4", wore his hair long, pink dress, pumps, hairy legs, all of that. But he wanted to talk to me one day about the issue. He wanted me to change how we were phrasing some things because he said, I can't get this bill passed with you. Keep calling it what it is. So I couldn't agree to change the language. It was effective. So we weren't going to do that. But we sat down in the Capitol cafeteria, and I'm sure we turned some heads as people are looking at the two of us, trying to figure out what's going on in that place. And so after we got through the initial talk of the legislation, I turned to him, I said, tell me your story. Help me understand who you are as a person. And he began to open up a tale, and he grew up not far from where I was living, and he was a preacher's kid. And growing up, he had kind of, effeminate characteristics. And Dad, the pastor, according to this gentleman, I wasn't there, I don't know, but he said, Dad didn't like that, and so Dad tried to beat the femininity out of me. And as a result of that, he just, as a rebellion against his dad, went further and further down this path. And, and my heart just breaks for this guy who was self-identifying as a woman. But it helps us understand that there is so much hurt, and there's so much pain, and there's so much trauma sometimes behind what you're seeing in some of these individuals. Understand that they are people created in the image of Jesus Christ, right? In the image of God, loved by Jesus Christ, that we have an opportunity to minister to them in amazing ways. So I love the fact that Brandon opens up his home to that kind of hospitality. We live in an apartment building in Rochester, and not far from our office, and there's some folks that I'm noticing in my apartment building that I've been thinking I need to start inviting over for dinner. And one of the dudes is bigger than me, but is identifying differently than I. And, I think maybe there may be a dinner invite coming up sometime soon. So
you have to be discerning, of course, but there's just follow the leading of the Holy Spirit. And there really are some wonderful testimonies when you can show the love of Jesus unconditionally to people, and it's powerful. I'll just share very briefly this one such case where I wasn't involved in this, but I heard this from a person in the know who I know they're telling the truth. But there was a meeting in 2019 at the Heritage Foundation, and believe it or not, it was a panel of all left-wingers sharing their perspective about why they oppose this. I mean, the Heritage Foundation is the nation's preeminent conservative think tank, but they were trying to be cross-partisan and operate in good faith with hosting people who, despite strong disagreement on other things, were willing to talk. And what they also had along with the panel was they brought policy wonks and Hill staffers to come speak with a group of mothers who had shown up, who had lost their daughters to trans. Some of them hadn't seen them for a long time. Daughters got testosterone, were bearded, awful things happened to their girls. And I'll never forget a radical feminist friend I know who said that she was just watching these policy wonks and Heritage Foundation staffers sit around the table with these mostly left-wing moms including a lesbian couple who their woke church kicked them out because they wouldn't allow their daughter to go on testosterone. And these lesbians were just weeping over their daughter. And these conservative Catholic and evangelical staffers at Heritage were just hugging them and holding them and consoling them, and just radical feminists were watching this like, what is going on in this room? Because many of them believe that we want to send them off to camps and electrocute them for, I mean, the stuff that a lot of the left-wing media tells them about what conservative Christians are. And, you know, I'm not going to say that there aren't some bad elements within the church. I see that too. If you talk about inside the church and outside, like I've done all that reporting. It's a gnarly mess sometimes, but like most socially conservative Christians are decent, kind, nice people, but they just don't know about that. They've never experienced, you know, the love of Christ through churches, and they have unfortunate experiences like that poor man whose father, the preacher, beat him. And so those are really amazing things that can happen when you just sit down and talk to people and dare to reach out, because there's a lot of suffering families out there. I'm sure it's happening in your communities. This is one of the most silent epidemics of suffering that I think when the spell finally breaks, I and my colleagues will not be shocked by the vast scope of how this tore apart so many families and communities. So that's why you need to step up.
Amen. And so as we begin to turn the corner and kind of close this time out, a couple of questions for you. One I want to ask you is this. From your perspective, you're watching nationally what's going on, what are legislators that are trying to resist this movement and are trying to get us back to some common sense in these issues? What are they doing to advance some of these positive things?
In the blue states?
Or blue states in particular, yeah.
Well, again, and I'm not here to advise what any of you should try to do, but I do know that there are some options. What some blue state, let's just face it, they're often Republican legislators, are doing is to try and get detransitioners insurance coverage and billing codes so that their health, having been wrecked by the hormones and the surgeries, that they can have a legitimate way for them to get the medical care to repair their bodies. You can get an insurance billing code for an orca bite, but there's nothing if you're a detransitioner and your hormones have been thrown out of whack and all of the endocrine complications and problems that causes. There's nothing for detransitioners. And so, I mean, I know of a legislator in Oregon that tried to do that, attach that to the healthcare bill that the Democratic leadership put forward, and he was ultimately not successful getting his amendment to add that provision there. Because detransitioners, they can be fast-tracked for the transition, but when they detransition, they have to pay out of pocket. And so it's just, you see the injustice within the medical system that they'll green light medical malpractice, but they will actually not help when you have to deal with the damage. So there is that. There are other, in terms of other blue states, I mean, blue state legislators have a really hard time because the Democratic Party leadership in the blue states and at the national level, this very much functions like it's kind of de facto religion for them. They kind of tend to see this through a civil rights prism and lens. They just think this is a normal extension of black civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, trans rights. So it's all sort of one track for many of them. But I think just as people are raising the alarm here in New York about the sports, all you have to do when you talk about gender ideology is just continue to expose its insanity, and eventually the weight of the lies that surround it will just crack under its pressure. I mean, I think eventually the side of sanity will prevail because we must prevail. It assaults our natural reason so profoundly. That's precisely the reason that it has to be defeated. And if the medical scandal weren't bad enough, it's just, I mean, who doesn't want to live in reality? I do. And so blue state legislators, even though they are in a tough spot, I think just to continue to talk about it because the truth will eventually prevail. But I know that there are creative ways to try and expose the harms, give a voice to those who are impacted by it. You know, in this age of social media, testimonies can go viral and people can actually see it, and then the truth slowly gets out. I mean, I know that there's been some advocacy about the prisons issue again, where, you know, women who have been raped and assaulted, or their voices are starting to get out. I mean, I think it's cruel and unusual punishment. And so as they learn to be creative, truthful storytellers and exposing the harms, eventually I think we can turn the tide around even in tough environments like blue states.
Do you have a piece of a piece you want to play for us? You think that'll work?
Sure. I've done a lot of print reporting on these issues. I'm not so much on the news side now. Still very much doing original shoe leather journalism on these issues, and I've produced 4 seasons of a documentary podcast. The second season was a free and downloadable ebook called Exposing the Gender Lie, which I co-authored with Dr. Jeff Myers of Summit Ministries. You can get that at christianpost.com/ebook/gender-lie, and that is the second season of the documentary podcast, which you can get at generationindoctrination.com. That's the name of it. And I think I would just, if I could say, if you take from what I've shared this morning nothing, is that I think it's so important for us as Christians to be people of compassion. And I mean that in a very literal sense. Compassion means with suffering. So if you engage this issue, you need to be prepared to suffer with people. But it's in the sharing and sufferings that we share in God's glory. So we don't have to stop with the suffering. That's not where it ends. But I think that it's so important that we do engage that. And I'd like to play a portion of an episode from season 3 that will really crystallize what I'm saying here, because the suffering with this issue in your family is off the charts agony. And I don't share this to be extreme, but I just think for so long people just kind of sugarcoated it and denied it and couldn't understand it. And so it's important that we actually tell the truth like it really is. And so what you're going to hear is about 90 seconds of an episode where I interviewed a mother whose daughter ran away from home to the state of Oregon, which I think is probably the worst state in the country, if I'm honest. And as a minor, was able to have her entire reproductive system cut out, her breasts amputated, she got the hormones as well, and she changed her legal name and gender in state court, and that was perfectly allowed, and Medicaid paid for all of the medical stuff, and it bypassed the insurance that she already had. And her mother was never informed or gave consent to any of it. So that's how dire it is. And at age 19, this young woman underwent a radial forearm phalloplasty where surgeons harvest a portion of her forearm to make a fake penis. And this mother had to be in the next room over, or next building over, while surgeons were carving up her beloved daughter. And I asked her to describe what that was like on season 3 of our documentary podcast, and I would like to play a portion of that for you now. Indeed, few people will ever know the off-the-charts anguish of what it's like to be powerless against the medical establishment, surgically maiming the child you love more than your own life. But Amy knows it, and it haunts her still. I asked her to share what it was like in the final moments when she realized that she could not prevent the supposed professionals from performing a radial forearm phalloplasty on her daughter.
I felt like my daughter was tied to train tracks, and there was this train coming, and I was trying to stop it. I'm screaming, "No, please don't hurt my daughter. Whatever you do, don't hurt my daughter. Just take my arm, don't skin her arm. Don't hurt her. Please don't hurt my daughter again." And there was nothing I could do. They did it. And it was just the night before, just staying up all night long. Like, I've never prayed so much in my life. Like, God, please do everything you can to stop it. And I couldn't, and it didn't happen. I wasn't able to do that. And so just being in the other room, knowing what doctors were doing to my daughter, knowing they were skinning her to create some crude manifestation of a penis, I just thought, what has this country become? Why is the United States leading the world in mutilating and sterilizing children? Where are we? What has happened?
That's a sample of my inbox. She's not the only one.
And that's tough to hear, but it's important that we do hear it, because we don't realize what's really going on. And if we're going to continue to fight back the evil monster of what this stuff is, it needs to be exposed. So I appreciate the work that Brandon Showalter and the Christian Post is doing to highlight in the platform what's really going on, that we can fight this back. So would you show your appreciation for Brandon's work?
Thank you.